everyone. We're going to get right to the panel here. I'll introduce the two distinguished gentlemen on the stage here with me. To my immediate right is David Crane. David is the President and CEO of NRG Energy. He's been in that job since 2003. He's had a long career in the power generation business, previously as a lawyer and an investment banker. Although way back when I learned he did own a bar called Graffiti in what they call the entertainment district of Hong Kong. That was his first business job. I don't know what the entertainment district means. Maybe the red light district?
Well, obviously your mind is in the wrong spot. No, it was not actually not that form of entertainment.
Okay.
So.
David also, I have to say, has a remarkable family. They have a great passion for the island of Haiti, have done a lot of work down there. We're going to talk a little bit later about David and NRG Energy's efforts to bring us a carbon-free Caribbean. And a quick plug, David H. Crane, David's son, is currently biking across Africa on behalf of Conservation International, and you can follow his journey at bike4nature.com. My far
Thank
right.
you for that. I'll give you the $20 later.
All righty. And on the right there is Richard Lester. Richard is the Japan Steel Industry Professor and head of the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT. He's also the faculty chair and founding director of the Industrial Performance Center. Richard's latest book is called Unlocking Energy Innovation: How America Can Build a Low-Cost, Low-Carbon Energy System. And since this panel is called Innovation, Creating Tomorrow's Utility, I do want to start with a question about that word, which is probably the favorite word you hear in American business. Everyone loves innovation, everyone is for it, no one's against it. But I want to ask you, do we need innovation to deliver affordable, reliable, low-carbon energy? Or do we have the tools we need today? Is it a question fundamentally of politics rather than technology? So, Richard, let me start with you.
Well, we don't have what we need, and we're going to need innovation to get what we want. I think we all agree on what we want. We want affordable, reliable, secure supplies of energy. We want energy that minimizes local environmental impacts. We want energy that minimizes global environmental impacts. And we want a strong and growing economy. And we want all of those things, and I would say that in each of those areas, we're doing not so well. And we're going to need innovation to address all of them. The biggest of those needs that is currently unfilled, of course, is climate change. But all of those other areas, too, demand innovation to get what we need.
So why is that? I mean, we know how to build distributed solar, concentrated solar, wind, nuclear. We have natural gas. What's missing from the mix? We have transmission. We know how to build transmission. We know how to do efficiency.
Yeah, so the scale of the requirements are just so much larger than I think many of us, even many experts, recognize. And the things that seem likely to do the best job in terms of, let's say, climate change are still not competitive in many places and in many applications with the high carbon incumbents. So the only way we're going to solve that is through innovation.
You mean clean energy is still too expensive? That's fundamentally what you're saying.
On the whole, we've got to reduce the costs.
David, do we need innovation, or can we get there with the tools we have?
No, I think it's clear that we need innovation. And I mean, you use different words, but the way I always sort of, my little formula as to what at least the electric industry, when I started, the mission of the electric industry was safe, affordable, reliable power. And then sort of about 10 years ago, sustainable sort of emerged as the sort of rising fourth. But I mean, we not only need, and there's so much focus in this room on, bringing up sustainable and making that all possible. But I think the 800-pound gorilla, in the room here is that the electric industry in this country is increasingly failing at the first three. Not as much the safe, but the affordable and the reliable, and particularly the reliable. And, I'm just always shocked, and, I would hope in a room full of technology, advanced technology experts like we have here, how, just for everyone to stop for a moment and think how shockingly stupid it is to, build a 21st century electric system based on a system of 130 million wooden poles. And maybe it's because, I was in New Jersey, the days after Superstorm Sandy, and I'm not proud of this, but I had to, ignore the governor's ban on driving to get my kids somewhere, and I drove around and I saw these poles thrown around like toothpicks, and you can try and strengthen the system all you want, but, as long as, I think if you assume as a matter of climate change that we're in the first stage of adaptation, that we have a system, designed in the 1930s and largely built between the 1930s and 50s, that's just not up for the weather challenges of the 21st century. And as soon as we face that, we'll stop trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and sort of talk about, how we get rid of the grid as opposed to making the grid strengthened in, certain spots. Was that a little bit more than you wanted?
No. Get rid of the grid.
Well,
Elaborate.
If we were sitting here 30 years ago and this wasn't an ARPA-E, if this was a telecom conference, if I had sat there and said, Marc, there'll be a day where people will not be, same storm, barrier islands of New Jersey, Verizon's not going to rebuild the copper line system because no one's using it anymore. But if I had sat here in 1985 with the cell phone on the, as part of the dialogue at that point and said, by 2014, the cell phone will have won total victory over the fixed line phone, you would have had me committed. Mm-hmm. I don't understand why it's so shocking to people to think that, the day is coming, I think within a generation where the grid at best is a sort of an antiquated backup system to a completely different way of buying electricity. And let me add one more fact in there just to really blow your mind. There are a lot of people in the room that are working on energy storage, and God knows we need you to work on it because, when we do microgrids, and we've announced a few microgrids on, high-profile places like Necker Island and things like that, the battery cost, the storage cost is killing us. Mm-hmm. In Haiti, the cost of storing electricity is killing us. So all of you all that are working on energy storage, keep it going. But in this country, we disrupt the electric grid with the natural gas grid. There are already 40 million American homes that are tied to the natural gas system. All those 40 million American homes need is a gizmo in the basement that turns natural gas into electricity, and you're done. You tell your electric company to go jump in the lake.
Well, we're going to get to that gizmo in a minute, but...
Well, there are multiple gizmos.
Okay.
Coming. I'm not here to pitch any one product, so...
So, do you agree, Richard? Do you see that kind of dramatic change ahead for the utility industry with the kind of disruption we've seen in the telecom industry?
Yeah, I think that the electricity industry over the next 20 years is going to be looking at changes, the scale of which we haven't seen in this industry for 100 years. I think these are going to be dramatically different times coming up, even though we think the last couple of decades with deregulation and restructuring was a turbulent time, and I guess it was. I think the next couple of decades are going to be still more turbulent, and I would cite maybe three main driving forces for the change. They may not be the same ones that David has pointed to, but one of them is demand. Demand has already, over the last 10 years, not really grown. And partly that's because we've had a pretty weak economy, but it's partly because we've gotten a lot better at getting what we need, and we're, of course, becoming more dependent on electricity in our daily lives, but we're getting better at getting what we need from electricity without using ever more. And that's a big change for any industry, to contemplate the possibility that in the long run, electricity demand just isn't going to grow very much.
And you're talking in the U.S. here,
I'm talking in the U.S. I'm going to come to the global picture in a minute. But that's the first change. The second change is what's happening with consumers. Now, in the power industry, consumers used to be called load. I don't know that too many people, I mean, what kind of a load? You know, that's changing. Consumers aren't consuming as much, but perhaps even more importantly, they're doing a lot of other things and will be increasingly doing a lot of other things too. They'll be self-generating, they'll be storing, they'll be shifting demand, they'll be doing a lot of other things that will make them much more proactive. Many consumers already are becoming more proactive, and they're going to have a lot of help in being more proactive from all kinds of companies, some of them probably sitting in this room, who are looking to help them become more proactive and do a lot of things in addition to consuming. So consumers aren't going to be consumers anymore. That's a big change. And the third huge change is one I already referred to. It's carbon. We've got to figure out how to get much, if not most, of the carbon out of the power system over the next few decades. That's where, of course, a lot of the carbon comes from, about 40% in this country. But even more than that, that's where many of the most interesting and probably economical opportunities to reduce carbon emissions are going to be found in the power sector. So hardly any demand, consumers becoming something else, and carbon are going to turn this industry on its head. I don't think, by the way, that the vision that David described with sort of getting rid of the grid is the way we're going to go, but we probably can talk about that in a few minutes.
So I think before we go any farther, David, why don't you just very briefly explain how NRG fits into the electric utility industry, because you're not, for the most part, the conventional regulated utility that serves customers, although I guess you do own some of those kinds of assets. You're predominantly in the power generation business, correct?
Well, I mean, we own we're about to own 53,000 megawatts of generation, which would make us, I think, the second largest generator in the United States. And we have 2.5 million customers that we serve directly. So, you know, we're in the retail side and the generation side. But you know, in the common vernacular, you know, I'm often introduced as a utility CEO, and every time, even after 10 years, it still makes me cringe, like a shiver goes down my spine, because, you know, for us, we think of a utility as, you know, someone who's been granted a monopoly by the state, and it doesn't matter how much they screw up their business, you know, the ratepayers in the state are ultimately going to pay for it. But they are constrained by service territories and things like that. And, you know, the beauty of being us is, I mean, we don't have that iron rice bowl, you know, to make up for all of our mistakes, but we do have the ability to innovate. And, you know, the IPP industry was originally set up to innovate because utilities don't innovate. They have no incentive to, and in fact, usually they're punished if they try to. It's just a problem with the business model. So we can innovate. We can go where we want as long as we're allowed to do it, you know, which, you know, currently means we can go to about 15 states out of 50, which is, you know, bizarre that in 21st century America you have to fight for capitalism. But you know, we can actually, where we see opportunity, we can go, and that's what we're doing now. And we see this extraordinary innovation. And if I could just comment on Richard's 3 points, because I think it's an interesting list of 3, because, you know, listening to him from a businessman's perspective, of course, you know, Richard is a renowned academic, is, you know, 2 of the 3 points he has, I agree with completely as a businessman. The third point, I think he's letting his academic roots show, which is the carbon point. I mean, as a human being, father of 5, you know, I do believe that climate change is the single greatest issue that mankind faces at this time. But let's not delude ourselves. The power industry in America today is not solving for carbon because no one has told them to solve for carbon, and no one has put a carbon price incentive, whether it be cap and trade or a carbon tax. No one has put that on the table, and no one I know believes it's coming, at any time soon. About 2008, when the Obama administration came in, we made an official decision at the board level to start pricing carbon into our forward models. We took that out, in 2011 and 2012, which is really sad. So I think the third point of Richard's 3 points is an outlier. His first 2 points, from a businessman's perspective, I absolutely totally agree with, which is, the sad truth of the power industry is that particularly if you define the business of being the production of conventional electricity, that is a business in terminal decline in the United States.
You mean centralized power, essentially?
Yeah, well, centralized, conventional, but I mean, the pace of utility-scale renewables easily exceeds demand growth. And when you think that the dark secret of the power industry is that rough and tough Americans probably waste in the home 20 to 25% of the electricity that's being used. And we're really just at the, having walked around for the last 10 years, turning off all the lights that my kids leave on, I don't believe much in terms of, voluntary conservation for 300 million Americans. But when it becomes fully automated, then I believe in it. And we're just, sort of Nest is a pioneer in that regard, and others are coming, and others are doing stuff. We're just at the brink. I mean, that 20% inefficiency in the home use system is about to come out of the thing. And so the pace of demand destruction in what is the highest value end of the power industry, which is selling to the home, not selling to industry or business, because they're pretty efficient already, that's just starting. And the other point that is one level of nuance beyond Richard's first point is, the other, it's not a secret, is that if you're in the wholesale power generation business, you make the vast majority of your money in peak hours, which are, 5 times 16. You don't make that much money overnight. If you break even, you're lucky. Well, what all this automation is going to do is not only going to reduce demand, it's going to flatten it out over the classic daily load cycle. And we're going to stop making money during peak hours. And I got to tell you, that sucks. So business has to adapt to this because the way we've made money is going to change. And so we better get on the front end of that curve.
Richard, how rapidly, and maybe again, you said you disagreed with the idea that distributed power is going to erode the importance of the grid, but maybe to either of you, how rapidly do you think significant numbers of customers are going to be generating their own power? If you look out 5 years from now, do you think it'd be 10 or 20 or 30%, or is that much too high?
I think that it's hard to say. I don't know the answer to that. But I think what's really an interesting thing from a business point of view as well as a policy point of view is to think about the balance between the development of the small things, distribution and end user related things, and the big things. My big worry is not that we're going to fail to figure out how to deliver new kinds of services to end users. I think that that's happening. I think much of the innovation is going to come from outside the traditional electricity industry. The innovators are not going to be the utilities. David has already said that. That's happening. But my big worry is that we're losing the ability to do the big things in the power industry. Now, you might say, and David already said it, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore because we're going to do it all at the end user level. And maybe that will happen. Certainly, we're going to see much more action at that end of the system. But I don't believe that we're going to be able to meet our needs, and by the way, even in the United States, with our relatively modest rate of growth, between now and 2050, we're going to be adding an economy the size of our existing economy, and we're going to have to meet the energy needs of that, and of course, globally, it's a much bigger deal even than that. But I don't think we're going to be able to address these issues of carbon, particularly, but the other issues we talked about, just relying on end-user innovation. I think we're going to have to do the big things to some degree. We're going to need big wind, big solar, big nuclear, which I hope we have a chance to talk about today, big transmission. And right now, we seem to be losing the ability to do that, because in order to do those big things, we need credit-worthy entities, either the builders, developers of these things, or the counterparties that they sell the power to. And my concern is that because of the way we regulate electricity particularly, we're losing that capacity. And if we lose that capacity, I'm not as confident as David that we're going to be able to make it up at the end user end.
David, what do you think? You've had both some real successes and some frustrations trying to do big things.
God, you're so polite. Well, I mean, I think what Marc's referring to is we were talking backstage. I mean, we tried to develop a nuclear plant a few years ago, an effort that ended with Fukushima, but you know, to be frank, it would have ended anyway because the low price of natural gas makes nuclear, you know, completely uneconomic, even with the generous incentives that Congress had put for nuclear in the Energy Policy Act of, I think it was 2005. So, no, I mean, I agree with Richard that maybe more than any advanced country, we just completely lack you know, the ability to do, you know, great things in this sector. I mean, we just ribbon cut with the Department of Energy, the Ivanpah project last week, which, you know, I think it's the most breathtaking thing. It's a big concentrated solar, 6 square miles, 340,000 mirrors, you know, pointed at 3 towers. And I think it's something that Americans should be incredibly proud of. You know, and all you get is like, you know, it's, you know, this is a problem, you know, you killed a bird, you know, and, you know, there's no vision and there's no passion to back it up. And yeah, no, so I mean, I would like, you know, I would like to think that the government could do great, ambitious things, but I don't have any faith in that. So the main thing is you want government to get out of the way and let the private sector do as well as the private sector can do, which I think is, you know, can lead to a pretty meaningful result. But we at least, I mean, it's a little bit more than the government getting out of the way. It's like, you know, government, stop doing stupid things. Like the system that we have in this country, government, it, you know, whether you know, like or not, it just perpetuates the status quo. You know, and that's tough in such an important industry that really should be changing dramatically. And the most obvious example of this, and you know, I could get it wrong, you know, but my understanding, again, going back to Superstorm Sandy, is that, you know, if you want FEMA money, you have to rebuild and you want to move fast, you have to rebuild exactly what you just had torn down. And you know, again, I hate to harp on the wooden poles. I don't know if there are any representatives of the wooden pole industry and you all laugh, but I mean, if you want to see one of the most surreal websites on the face of the earth, go to woodenpoles.org. And then you'll find out how cutting down a pine tree, stripping off its arms, infusing it in tar, and then hanging a wire on it is the most environmentally sensitive and durable part of our electric system in the United States. But I mean, you know, I mean, just the rule on, okay, so we do have this system, you know, it's $1 trillion system, it's largely paid for, you know, let's keep using it because it's fully amortized, but, you know, if it gets torn down, don't rebuild the same thing. Yeah. I mean, that's really dumb.
I want to get to nuclear, but before we do, the Ivanpah plant, will there be another one like that now that we've built one? Presumably the first one's the hardest.
Well, the irony is we do live in a world of, free enterprise and technological change. And the fact is that when Ivanpah got started, when it won its power purchase agreement from the state of California, which, it was done not by us, but by BrightSource, the original sponsor, that was probably in the 2007, 2008. And at that time, concentrating solar and solar PV were about the same price. In the 6 years it's taken to develop and build the project, in this country at least, solar PV, is carrying the day. So will there be another one? You'd have to ask BrightSource, but, for our money at NRG, we're banking a lot more on solar PV. Because the one thing I would tell you, Mark, as well, is that the utilities are people responsible for the grid, so that they prefer, concentrating solar, the thermal technology, rather than PV because it whipsaws the stability of the grid less. But if you ever ask them to put a number on that, okay, so what's that worth to you? You can't get it. That's one of the problems. There's no transparency in that. So without that data, just straight as a price point, solar thermal in this country today with the price of silicon and the pace of technology, we don't see it being able to compete with solar PV.
Okay. So nuclear, Richard, I read a recent speech where you said, and I'm going to quote here, "Nothing has come close to matching nuclear when it comes to being able to scale up low carbon energy rapidly," unquote. I think that's going to come as news to David, given his experience in Texas. But what did you mean by that, and why do you believe we need nuclear to get to the place where we all want to go again, reliable, affordable, low-carbon energy?
I'm sorry, what's the quote again?
The quote was, "Nothing has come close to matching nuclear when it comes to being able to scale up low-carbon energy rapidly."
All right, so first of all, let me start by saying rapid scale-up. If you care about carbon, if you care about climate change, then you have to care about being able to scale up low-carbon energy supply rapidly. We can go into the numbers, but that's just a fact. So when you look at history and facts rather than aspirations, and look at where and when did we scale up low-carbon energy fastest, the answer is not in Denmark, and it's not in Spain, and it's not in Germany over the last 10 years, where they were, of course, quite rapidly introducing solar and wind. But the figure of merit that you need to look at is kilowatt hours, if we're talking electricity, per person added per year. That's really the key measure of scale-up. And when you look at that metric, you find that the countries that added most low-carbon electricity were France in the 1970s and 80s, and even more rapidly, Sweden in the 1970s and 80s, Belgium in the 1970s and 80s, and even, although not quite as fast, the United States in the 70s and 80s, and it was coming from nuclear. So on that metric, nuclear way outpaces, or way outpaced in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, what we have done more recently with solar and wind. We need much more rapid scale-up of solar and wind. This is not a statement against that, but it is just on the basis of the facts. Nuclear has, in recent decades, achieved by far the fastest scale-up of low-carbon energy, which really is the name of the game if you care about climate change. Now, the problem is that when you look at plans around the world for nuclear, we don't seem to be able to, I don't think we're going to be able to do it again. Certainly there are a few places around the world, China being the obvious example, where there are very aggressive, ambitious plans to scale up nuclear. But when you add it all up, and when you also take account of the fact that the bulk of the nuclear fleet around the world is getting a little old, and many, if not most of those plants are going to be retired over the next couple of decades or 3 decades, it's not, as I say, it's not adding up. And by the way, in the US too, we're looking at, over the next 20 or 30 years, the retirement of probably 100 gigawatts of nuclear. We talk a lot about a few gigawatts going away in the near term because they can't compete with gas or wind or whatever it is, but the bigger deal here is that we're going to lose 100 gigawatts probably before the year 2040. And by the way, we're also going to lose probably 300 gigawatts of coal before then. So we have a big gap in baseload electricity that maybe we can replace some of with distributed, but
Richard,
probably not all.
Where's the evidence that there's any political support for nuclear power in the U.S.?
Well, there isn't a lot of political support for it. I mean, on either the Republican side or the Democratic side, for different reasons, we're not seeing a lot of support. And so the question is, what's it going to take to make nuclear a viable part of a both domestic and global carbon emission reduction strategy? I think part of the answer to that question is the subject of this panel, innovation. I think what's going to have to happen is an already safe technology, nuclear, is going to have to be made safer, demonstrably safer, as well as less expensive and more secure against nuclear terrorism and nuclear proliferation. Those are probably the needs in order to reestablish nuclear as a serious part of a global climate response.
David, in the long term, I assume you would agree with Richard that nuclear is an important option and that we need to find a way to get there. Right, your skepticism has to do with short-term political considerations, or am I wrong?
Well, look, I mean, I generally agree completely with Richard on this. The nuclear plant we were going to add in Texas, when it was built out, 4 units, that one plant would have displaced the entire anthropomorphic, carbon emissions of the country of Belgium. One plant. And so if you want to move, if you're solving for carbon change, and you're a serious person, your strategy starts with nuclear. Okay. And that's what we believed several years ago. The only problem is that, I live in the real world, and now it's just not. There is no political will because the private sector in the United States cannot do it right because of the nature of the way the system was set up, 55 utilities or something like that. One of the things that shocked me when we built Ivanpah, the 3 towers, was standing on the first tower and watching how quickly the 3rd tower went up compared to the 1st tower. I mean, I know it's an old-fashioned basic concept, but concepts of learning curves, economies of scale. I mean, we talk about the new nuclear age, each plant wasn't supposed to be a one-off and all this, but if you really want to get nuclear's price point to where it is, you just got to make a commitment to build 20 or 30 of them. You can't start with 1 in Georgia, and there's just no politician of any, and you have to put on the back of the government, probably the Defense Department, because they're the only ones big enough to do it. And there's just nobody talking about this. It's just not even in the cards. So you say short term versus long term. I don't think it's happening in the short term. It's probably not happening in the medium term. I just hope to the extent we are 30 years from now relying on the grid, that we're looking at a network. What I would do in this country is I'd say look, let's start with 20 or 30 plants. We'll keep them out of, leave seismic zones, California out of the mix. densely populated northeast side of the mix, but let's build a network, a spine, through, Texas, the South, up through the Midwest, 20 to 30 plants, common procurement. And, I'm not sure we'd get the price all the way down to where gas-fired combined cycle or new wind is pricing. But the question, for society like this facing the issues we have is not really, is it the lowest cost alternative? Is it an alternative that we can readily afford as a society? And at that price, I think, we'd be able to readily afford it.
So one thing you are doing in the short term is developing this project with Dean Kamen. I guess it's called the Beacon 10. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, part of the Beacon 10, it's a machine. It's based on Stirling engine technology. And I know I'm in a room with a bunch of technologists, and I say, if you have any questions about this later, I cannot answer them. But I have a colleague in the front row who can. Again, it comes back to this basic idea that if we have a gas system, one of the things that frustrates me and no one in the press talks about is that this natural gas revolution we've had in this country through fracking and all is that the American public is not experiencing the benefit of it. I mean, just one fact, in 2008, when natural gas was $13 per million BTU, Americans spent $225 billion on natural gas. In 2012, Americans spent $70 billion on natural gas and got more natural gas for it. The price had come down. But it's not getting to the retail customer. And the best I can figure out, it's all being absorbed by the electric company and the gas distribution companies who are using that money to increase their spend on transmission and distribution. So it gets back to this, why do Americans, no one sits around and says, why do I have two expensive energy delivery systems into my home? The transmission line and the gas line. And if I could do everything I want with one, which one am I going to pick? The one that gets torn down in every storm or the one that's already underground? Well, I pick the gas line. So the idea based on Stirling Technologies is, you don't have the fundamental problem we have in the electric industry, which is, the dirty secret of the electric industry is that we consume something like 50% of the fresh water in the United States to cool our power plants. Because big power plants need so much cooling that it's just too much heat to dissipate. But if you do it in your basement, the waste heat, which is 70 or 80% of the total, can be put to use in hot water, or if you're one of 3 million Americans that have a pool, you can heat your pool, all this stuff, or you can heat your house if you have the right system. So the idea is that Dean has invented a machine based on the Stirling engine, or as he likes to dumb it down for me, the compressor in your refrigerator running backwards. Think about it, Mark. I'll keep going. So, but the idea is that you put this in the basement, and it's a 10 kilowatt machine, and you can easily handle the average in bigger American homes with 10 kilowatts. But the other advantage, and what got us there, is because we've been a big believer in distributed solar, is that this machine, to be grid tied, has all the inverters and other electric components that solar needs to be grid tied. And those components in the Dean machine, or the Beacon 10 as it's officially called, you can run 5 kilowatts of solar through it, so it makes the solar on your roof much cheaper. But the key to the Beacon 10 right now is the political concern, because it's very clear that the traditional utility industry is going to try and slow down the renewables industry, particularly distributed renewables industry, by fighting the fight over net metering and
who's going to pay for the grid?
Yeah, who's going to pay for the grid, and you're freeloading on the grid and all this stuff if you generate your own power. So for the American consumer to achieve their full destiny of making their own power and not having to pay all the economic benefit of that to the utility for the privilege of being backed up by the grid, the American public needs to be able to say to the electric company, I don't want your line anymore. And that's where the Beacon 10 comes in, because it's reliable power. It's not intermittent. It's tied to the gas line, which has a higher degree of, and this machine is is being demonstrated in the field. We hope to be in the market and selling it by next year.
Richard, what do you think? Is that an example of innovation that might be useful?
It sounds like a great example. I don't know the details, but we are going to have to get a lot smarter about how to integrate these different kinds of systems with or without grid backup. And this sounds like there are a lot of interesting schemes out there, even, by the way, including schemes for integrating nuclear and renewables more effectively. And the problem that David referred to, which is the resistance within the electric utility industry and regulators to these things, is a big problem. And we're going to have to get smarter, not only have smarter grids, but we are going to have much smarter regulatory institutions than we've had in at least the recent past.
So just a few seconds left. If we need smarter regulators, smarter politicians, how do we get there? How do we persuade political leaders that it's time to price carbon, that it's time to introduce competitive measures into the electricity system?
Well,
just a quick thought or two.
Okay, I mean, all of the pros, I'm obviously not a pro, say that the prospects for pricing carbon anytime soon are very non-existent. I'll take that. I wish it wasn't true, but I'll take it. I think what we have to do here is to recognize that when we first started talking about climate, we got it wrong. We started talking about it as a regulatory issue. We've got to mandate reductions in carbon. I think the way to we have to have a new approach. We only have one chance to get it right this time. We don't have time to get it wrong again. I think that new approach has to be about innovation, that addressing climate is not so much a regulatory issue as it is an innovation issue, a way to get costs down, more attractive services, and so on. I think we have to shift the center of gravity of the debate about climate away from mandates, forcing things that people don't want into the system, and towards innovation and systems and products and services that people do want.
We're out of time. Do you want a quick thought?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think if you go back to how did the Green Committee lose the climate change debate when we had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, it was because the opposition scared the American public that going green was going to ruin their lives. The world, thanks to innovation, has changed. You know, the opposition didn't persuade people, the Americans. Americans are too smart to, believe that climate change isn't happening. I mean, they're growing corn 90 miles into Canada, now in what used to be winter wheat, land. So all the Republican farmers in the grain belt, they know the weather's changing. It was that fear tactic. But if you look at the consumer products that the green industry has come up with, just look at the discussion around the Tesla S. 5 years ago, whenever you talked about green products, it was all about their constraints and they were too expensive. The Tesla S is kicking the ass of, did I say that out loud? So the idea is the politicians are only going to act when the public asks for it. And so I just think we have to keep pushing, green products, and that being green does not necessarily mean a compromise of capability, of price, or anything. And that's really what our focus needs to be, at least for the next few years while this paralysis in Washington hopefully plays itself out.
Great. Make it more exciting. Please join me in thanking David and Richard.